Let me start by welcoming all of you to this session. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Kalyan Viswanathan, and I have the privilege of being the current president of Hindu University of America. I'm also facilitating this class called the Orientation to Hindu Studies. And we are all part of that. Many of us are part of that class here. And in addition, this webinar is being offered by Dr. Joydeep Bakshi, who is located in Berlin, Germany. And I wanted to extend a very special welcome to Dr. Joydeep Bakshi. Joydeep, can you hear me? You'll have to unmute so as to speak. Yeah. Can you hear me, Joydeep?
Yeah. Did you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. So I want to, actually, I would like Dr. Joydeep Bakshi to introduce himself. And I'll just say this briefly. He has a PhD in philosophy from the University of the New School of Social Research based in New York City. He's currently in Germany. And one of the unique characteristics of Dr. Joydeep Bakshi is that he knows the German language. Not only he knows the German language, he is deeply studied German philosophy, German Indology, German ways of trying to understand Hinduism, and the intersection between Germany and India that occurred over a 200-year, 300-year period, the consequences that unfolded thereof. Okay, so with that brief introduction, let me turn it over to Joydeep. Over to you, Joydeep. And once again, let me make an appeal to everybody. Please turn on your video camera so we can see you when you want to engage with you. Okay, so I am going to do something. I'm going to mute everybody. And then Joydeep, you'll just have to unmute yourself and you can take it over. Thank you.
Now I've unmuted myself.
Yes.
So everyone can hear me. All right. Good evening, everyone. I want to especially thank you for coming. It is a free webinar, but you've still made out time. You've given 1 hour of your time and you've taken an interest in the topic. It's an academic topic, so we really appreciate your coming to hear this thing. Think of it, although it's a webinar, although for all of us technology is new, this is a new format. We're all used to interacting personally in a classroom. Think of it as your online classroom. So feel free to ask questions. If they don't take us off on a tangent, I'll answer them. Let's try and keep some of the interactivity of a personal encounter, because this is your first introduction to the Hindu University of America. Okay, so having said that, I want to extend a thanks to 2 people. One, Kalyan, president of HUA, and Siddhi, whose role and duty and function goes beyond even a president's, because everything the president doesn't do, she does. So we're very grateful to her for keeping this whole thing moving. Now, I also want to thank you all for coming, because today is a very holy and auspicious day. It is Shivratri. So I want to begin by acknowledging that it is Shivratri. I want to acknowledge that the Hindu University of America has taken a big step forward in saying there needs to be a space to articulate Hindu ideas, Hindu concerns, a Hindu cosmology, and we are all part of that community now. All right. So how did I get to German Indology? I was in Germany studying German philosophy and German intellectual history. That is my main background. And of course, the German language was a big part of that. Many of you will have heard of the work of Vishwa, who is my teacher, my colleague, my friend, and my co-author. And it was really through him that this interest in German Indology came about. If you've read some of his interviews, if you go to academia.edu or you just Google his name, you'll find several interviews where he discusses his experiences in Germany and how he came as a philosopher, having studied with Rainer Schurman, well-versed in the continental tradition of philosophy, and the kinds of incredible racism, the prejudices he faced in Germany. Now, there are 2 ways you can react to prejudice. There is the way where you walk away and you say, okay, these people are racist. There is the way where you take it personally and you shout back and you get into a fight with these people. And there happens to be a third way. So either of these ways, you still remain at the level of engaging with these people. But there's a third way to say, intellectually, where is this coming from? There's something in the background of this that is worth looking at. And that's what Vishwa and I did. So by no means is the engagement with Indology in the sense of a personal encounter. There was obviously a personal background to it that got us interested. But if it was simply at the level of they were racist towards Indians, you know, it would be at the level of a Twitter fight or something. We specifically decided something interesting is happening in Indology and that's worth studying. Let me turn then to the book that maybe all of you know, that is the Nay Science. This is not to praise or promote the book. It's already 4 years old. Most of you may have heard of it. It's simply to say that that was the output that this encounter with Indology resulted in. So the seminar today is an excerpt from the book, but also the book was 5 years ago, 6 years ago that it came out from Oxford. So we have obviously progressed in our thinking, and I want to give you sort of the bigger picture of Indology that we have acquired over this period. Now, there'll be a lot to cover, a lot of material. I'll go slowly, I'll keep it simple. Feel free to stop me at any time. And I know some of this is new, some of it is technical. The first thing I'm going to do is share with you a handout so that you have it on your computer, in front of you. Did everyone get the file through the chat window? Hello?
Yeah, we're getting it. And as whoever's got background noise, please kindly mute yourself.
Wonderful. So keep that open. You don't need to read it right now. I'll just give it to you. Most of the quotes, the shorter ones are anyway on the PowerPoint when I start sharing the PowerPoint. But this is just for you if there's some longer things we want to read together. Okay. Now, the only thing you have to do is be a little patient with me as regards time, because I do want to lay this out carefully. And if you feel, you know, that I'm going a little slow, you can say, yes, we get it, and speed it up. But let's be careful to begin with. So I'm going to start a share now of my PowerPoint, which of course would be nice if I figured out. Does one start the, no, first one shares the screen and then one starts the PowerPoint, right?
Yep.
Why is it not sharing? Give me 1 second. So it's Aryanism and Indology. I'm sharing right now. Okay, settings, allow Zoom. It's saying privacy setting you cannot share. Give me 1 second. You have to excuse me, I'm getting a message. Zoom will not be able to record the contents of your screen until it is quit. So I will just quit and come back.
Oh, sorry about that.
Yeah.
He'll be back in a minute. But let me offer a couple of things while he's back on the webinar. For most of us, you know, we do not have a very good understanding of the level of engagement that Germany has had with Hindu texts and traditions. You know, we might have heard of Max Müller. We might have heard of a couple of other figures, in German figures in Indology. Can anybody name 2 or 3 other Germans besides Max Müller who was engaged with Indian texts and traditions? You know, type it in the text window, the chat window, please. Yeah, William Jones was not a German.
Oh, so.
Okay. Yeah.
We have Joydeep ji.
All right, very good.
Yeah, I'm back. It had a privacy setting issue because the the software was, Mac software had been updated last week. All right. So can everyone see this?
Yes.
And now I'm going to try and go into full screen view.
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. And everyone has the handout. So this is the Aryanism and Indology webinar. Let's begin right away with why we begin this seminar. The whole Aryan ideology as it developed in Germany led ultimately to one of the greatest genocides and certainly the greatest deliberately planned genocide in human history. 6 million Jews were killed, but we must not forget that many Sinti and Roma were killed, many German children who were considered undesirable or handicapped or did not fit a certain ideal of Germanhood, many homosexuals. So this was a very, very deliberate, systematic culling of the human race, unlike anything that has ever been seen before. The picture I'm showing you is from the collection of the US Holocaust Memorial Museum. If you're ever in DC, I highly recommend going and seeing it. And you see on the bench, it says, Nur für Arya, only for Aryan. So only as an Aryan are you allowed to sit on this bench. And it's of course an interesting contrast because it's not clear if the book is also only for Aryans, right? Or if only reading that book is permitted for Aryans. I want to start by remembering that as the reason for all the work that Vishwa and I do and why we have dedicated our lives to this engagement with Indology. Now, here are the goals of the webinar. I'm going to give you a working definition of Indology. Then we're going to look at the relationship of Indology to Aryanism. Then we're going to see that historical studies or the historical approach is the linchpin, the key to that relationship. And finally, we'll say a few words on the concentration history and methods at HUA. What do we mean by Indology? Now, it would be ridiculous in a seminar of Indology to give you a complete account of India. In fact, no one can. There would be too many subfields, too many areas of expertise for any one human in his lifetime to give you a complete, logos means is the Greek word for account. To give you a complete account of India is impossible. The Indologists themselves could not do it. None of them ever covered more than one particular subfield. So we have to look when we give a seminar on Indology, not to try and cover as many fields of Indian studies as possible. That would be specialized subdisciplines, but for Indology itself as a discipline. What do we mean when we say something is Indology? What are the principles that sustain Indology? What is the unifying feature, the distinctive feature when you look at Indian tradition, the way Indians always have, and when you look at it the way German Indologists set it up? So this is the working definition. In the 19th century, Indology is a raciological system. It is a scientific export of racial and historicist othering within Europe and also to India and the world. And then in the 20th century, it becomes the most pernicious form of racism. German Indology places itself in the service of projects of racial classification and genocide. Now, these are big claims, but I am not the only one to have made them. If you can see behind here, I have collected some of the literature, Aryan Myth by Polyakov, Aryan Idols, and so on. So there is a large body of literature that somehow sees Indology as playing a key role in this. If you take a course with me, we will of course go through some of the essential works on this. For the moment, do not trouble yourself with the fact that every Indologist, and especially the German Indologists, will strenuously deny that this is what they do. They are ignorant of their history. They of course have an axe to grind. They have chairs to defend. They want to get students, and they don't want, I mean, if this connection is brought out into the light, it's game over for them vis-a-vis being funded by universities in Germany. Okay, let's move from our working definition now. So the second thing I said is we're going to look at Aryanism, Aryan ideology. Now, as you know, in the 20th century, this concept gained a certain scientific legitimacy. There were a lot of treatises, a lot of work on it. Even Indological texts that did not specifically engage with Aryanism, the undercurrent was always in terms of the Aryan invasion into India, how that affected Indian culture, how you can explain Indian history and chronology of texts in terms of pre-Aryan, Aryan, etc. So underlying Indology was a strong bedrock of Aryan ideology. And we will be asking, what kind of science is it? Is it history? You can certainly give a history. Is it linguistics? You can certainly use the linguistic criterion to develop something like an Aryan category. But we will see all these are insufficient. In fact, I'm going to make the claim here that the whole Aryan race theory has theological origins. It goes back to a theological distinction that is innate to Christianity. So on the left is a famous painting by Caravaggio. Does anyone know what the painting is? It's Paul. That is Saint Paul, not Saint Paul at that point. At that point, he is still someone called Saul. He's a Jewish priest. And there's this famous moment of conversion on the road to Damascus when he falls off his horse. Caravaggio has captured the exact moment where the horse's hoof threatens to crush him. And before that, he had persecuted the Christians. And at this moment, he has a sudden epiphany and he realizes that the law, the Mosaic law, if time is short, if death is imminent, the law cannot be fulfilled and he cannot be saved through the law. But Jesus, the Messiah, if he has come and repealed the law, if he has fulfilled the law, then salvation is already achieved for him. So this is that famous moment captured by Caravaggio. On the right, in contrast with that moment of conversion, you see a painting. It actually hangs in, it's part of the Isenheim altarpiece, and it is in a Catholic church, painted by a Catholic painter, but it has a certain significance, which is that Karl Barth, the most important Protestant theologian of the 20th century, hung it above his desk and looked at it every day, and he thought it was the epitome of Luther's notion of salvation. So that is the broken, crucified Christ, and I believe it's John the Baptist is pointing to his wounds. Actually, it is a form of Christ who is sick and was prayed to by people who had this illness, but Karl Barth gave it a new meaning. Okay, let me then give you from Paul certain distinctions that he makes, which bear out this notion of two covenants. So on the left, you see the new covenant, and on the right, you see the old. This is the contrast that is made, that the previous picture captures, between what it means if you're saved through the law and between what it means if you are saved through Christ, that is through grace. So on one side, you have the gospel or the new message, the annunciation. On the other, you have the law. On the left, you have grace. On the right, you have sin. Church, synagogue, new, old, Christian, Jew, law of the spirit, law of the letter. So this is an important distinction. The law of the letter they're speaking of is the interpretation of the Bible. The law of the spirit will be that the new meaning that comes about through Christ. These distinctions became increasingly significant with Luther. So we're now going to move to Germany from this ancient background and look at the way a certain strain of anti-Semitism develops in Germany. This is Luther on the Jews and their lives in 1543. And these are the instructions he writes to the civil authorities and to pastors and preachers. I won't read all of them out, that'll take too long, but you can see specifically how much of this was fulfilled, how much of this all actually came about in the 20th century. This is not to say that pogroms against Jews did not exist before that. In fact, Vishwa and I are currently translating a book on the Jewish experience in the 20th century, 19th and 18th century. But certainly a certain strain of anti-Semitism is present with Luther. And it is the working out of that anti-Semitic sort of that salvation drama vis-a-vis the Jews that is for us the key to understanding German Indology. This is Juden. This is quite common on Protestant churches in Germany, actually all pre-Protestant. But the specific interpretation that Luther gives, this one was carved on the church in Wittenberg, and Luther gives it a specific interpretation that is new, that did not exist before him. And he says, here in Wittenberg, there is a sow carved in stone. Under her, young piglets and Jews lie sucking. Behind the sow stands a rabbi who lifts the sow's right leg, and with his left hand, he pulls her ear over himself. He bends down and looks more studiously under her rear at the Talmud inside, as if he wanted to read and see something difficult and special. This is most likely where they got their Shem Hamphoras from. Shem Hamphoras is the name of the ineffable one, also known as the Tetragrammaton, that is the letters that we know now, but that we pronounce as Yahweh, but you're only supposed to have the 4 letters. Okay, let's move here. There is a theological conflict. I've shown you the anti-Judaic sentiment. There is a theological conflict in the background. Luther is obsessed with showing that Jesus is the Messiah spoken of in the OT, Old Testament. However, if there are thriving Old Testament communities who read the Old Testament without the New, show you that you don't need the New Testament to complete the meaning of the Old, which is the Hebrew Bible. If the Hebrew Bible continues to exist, then your Christian salvation, your Messiah, is problematic. So Luther, in fact, lectures obsessively on the OT. He lectures far more on the Old Testament than he does on the New. So the statistics are there, I won't read them out. Thriving Old Testament communities pose a challenge to Christian supersessionism. If someone is still reading the Hebrew Bible and saying, hey, this book is complete and full in itself, my community is sufficient, I can read and make sense of the world, I can make sense of these texts, there is a problem for Christian supersessionism. Supersessionism just means the view that salvation through Christ replaces the old salvation. You saw that in the picture of Paul and the Christ on the cross, the crucified Christ. If the OT can be read without the NT, argument for Christians as the chosen people. Remember, with the new covenant, God is supposed to have moved his favor, is moved. If the OT can be read without the NT, then that argument that God has moved his favor does not work. At this point, Luther introduces a theological innovation. The interpretation will no longer be textual. The fight will no longer be textual. It will be moved to a space called history. The argument for Christians as a chosen people is moved from theology to history. So if you have the handout before you, you can read it, or the text is already on the screen. This is Luther Lectures on Genesis 12. Therefore, this text clearly compels us to confess that the Messiah or Christ has long since come and was revealed, and that he brought a spiritual and eternal blessing with him into the world. Now, see how Luther continues. The wretched Jews were deprived of both their material and their spiritual blessing because they would not recognize Christ. How do we have a proof of this? History. They have now been living for almost 1,500 years under great hardships and in uninterrupted captivity, and they have nothing of the promises of which the Lord is speaking here, etc., etc., etc. So the debate now is no longer in terms of, are you reading the Hebrew Bible better than me? Am I correctly interpreting Jesus as the Messiah? Or are you correct in saying the prophecies have not yet been fulfilled? The Messiah is yet to come. Luther has moved that debate to history and said, it's settled. How is it settled? Because if you look at the history of these people, 1,500 years, God has no truck with them. God has broken with them. They are no longer the chosen people. There are 2 other citations on your handout. The first is Luther Lectures on Genesis 17. God transfers his favor. What else are the Jews today than a body miserably torn to pieces and scattered throughout the entire world? They have no definite place and no offices that are necessary for the establishment of a state. Hence, God is either lying in his promise, or the Jews are no longer the people of God, but have been rejected by God and put out of the church. And finally, the last quote, also from Genesis 17, history will continue to confirm this as long as we are attentive to it. So let's summarize. From textual battles, from interpretation of text, differences about the correct way to read text, a new space has opened up called history. The argument for Christians as a chosen people is moved from theology to history. God has transferred favor from Jews to Christians. History continues to confirm this fact as long as we are attentive to it. Suddenly, it becomes very, very important to pay attention to history, to study everything in terms of history. This experience, which is formulated in terms of the relationship to Judaism, and this is characteristic of Protestantism, will also affect the way German Protestants, who then study Sanskrit, look at Indian texts. Okay, let's continue. Let me skip this one. It's a little too detailed. I'll come back to it if there are questions about it. Now, this was part one of my outline or my explanation. The second part comes about in the 19th century with two figures we all know. Schlegel, we know the brother Schlegel. This is the elder Karl Wilhelm Friedrich Schlegel. And we will soon look at his brother August Wilhelm Schlegel, who became the first holder of a chair for, it is usually called the chair for Indology in Bonn. It was actually for literature. And these two have a particular interest in race. So this is Schlegel saying, the African race has struck all natural scientists. It is distinctive from all the others. It is not between an ape and a human, although it has these sort of ape-like features, but it is human, although of a lower degree. Why am I introducing this at this point? This is the second part of the thesis vis-a-vis Indology. Indology had a very problematic relationship from its origins with India, where India was seen as the birthplace of all culture, of all civilization. Sanskrit was thought to be the root language from which the European languages were derived. And therefore, to claim proximity to India, to study India, was a way for Germans to elevate themselves. And you will see explicit quotes from Schlegel where he tries to do that. As the German prestige increased and India's declined, this relationship becomes problematic. And there are certain inversions that start happening in this relation. It's important for us to remember that Indology not only has this anti-Judaic component that comes from German Protestantism, it was always a race play, to use a very modern term, a race play between Indians and Europeans. In this race play, who is excluded? The Africans. Okay. Here's another quote, the Ethiopians, by this he means all black Africans, not specifically what we today call Ethiopia. And again, you see the comparison with animality. So animality, lack of proper speech, primitivism, these are all the hallmarks of the black race. Schlegel is the earliest to formulate the theory of two human stocks. So you see two columns here. There is an Asiatic stock. Now you'll say, what happened to the European? He subsumed the European under the Asiatic. In fact, the Europeans have descended from the Asiatic. This is the donor culture. The African is the donee culture. So one gives culture, one receives it. One speaks a divine language, the other merely sounds human. It is imitative, but actually they are natural sounds or animal cries. So that is all Africans are capable of. The Asiatic is the bearer of great historical changes. The African is excluded from human progress. The Asiatic seeds cultures, whereas Africa receives culture. It has to be colonized, and through its colonies, for example, he thought Egypt was actually an Indian colony, and that the Egyptian priesthood was like the Brahmin priesthood, and Egyptian language had come from India. So he has some very bizarre connections he makes. But what allows you to divide up people like this? The division will be on the basis of language. And this is Schlegel again. Merely external physical comparison of the Earth's inhabitants does not lead to a satisfactory result. We must turn for assistance in the evaluation of the different peoples to another principle, one that is appropriate to the higher nature of man. So when you are no longer looking at man as a natural being, but specifically as a cultural being, language will now allow you to separate them, humans, into groups. This principle is language. So we've seen how history was introduced. The motivation was theological. From history, we have moved to race. From race, we have moved to language. The Asiatic descent of white tribes in Europe and the black inhabitants of southern India is historically demonstrated by language and all other possible proofs. What these proofs are, he does not say, but the language connection is sufficient for him. All culture is now radiating outwards of India. There would in fact be no history of America if everything had remained in the same state, and if they had not received from Asia and Europe some contribution of and seed of high intellectual activity, education, and movement. So not only is there a linguistic distinction, but there is continuously a distinction between cultured peoples who give culture to others and primitive peoples who receive that. This is just to summarize what I previously showed you. The second point is important. It is the first point we already went over, that language proves that relationship. So while comparative religions, comparative mythology will give you some indication that Europe is linked with Asia, it's language that will show that innate connection. Then he says it also confirms the unity of origin of all Asian culture, and this latter is the genuine object and purpose of all history. Not any other peoples are to be studied. Only this people is the proper subject of history. So let me take a sidebar here. You have wondered what this topic called history and method that HUA is offering. It is not a course in Asian history or in Indian history. It is a reflection on why suddenly history comes to have this specific meaning of national history, the history of a people, the history of a race, and how these various national histories are then summed up and sort of collectively empty themselves out into something called world history. This was the intellectual project of Germany that it very successfully exported to the rest of the world. Okay, the last point is self-explanatory, but notice again who is missing. It is the Africans. Let's now come to the brother, August Wilhelm Schlegel. This was a little background from his brother to tell you how the racial thing came about. But now we want to look at August Schlegel. August Schlegel asks 3 questions. Let me give you those questions. The first question is concerning migration. And this is the essay he wrote on the origin of the Hindus. It's in French, but a colleague of mine, Edward Butler, has translated it. Hopefully it will be published in the volume soon. And it is essential reading for everyone to understand modern India. If you want to understand the way India defines itself today, Hinduism defines itself as one people, one nation, one race. Many of these ideas are actually coming from the way German Indologists looked at India. So migration. Whence have come the ancestors of the nation in question? Which country did they inhabit previously? By what route did they arrive, by land or sea? And when did this take place? That's the first question. The second question is on race and purity. To which race of men does this nation belong? To what family of peoples? And are the Hindus a pure race or a mixed race? And then the third question he asks is origins. This central country, where will we look for it if not in the interior of the great continent, in the vicinity and to the east of the Caspian Sea? So this is just a sidebar to tell you so many of the issues that modern India has been concerned with. Aryan migration. Are the Hindus one people? Are they one nation? Are they all related? Do they form a separate group of peoples? All these questions come up in this 1834 essay. It is creating a different way of looking at Hinduism and a different way to articulate at Hinduism that has a very problematic background, as I showed you in the first part of this presentation, and of course will have very problematic consequences. So let us not be naive and think that Germans simply wanted to study India. There was a lot of background, a lot of toxic ideology there that has to be accounted for. Okay. The answer to all 3 questions will be given by language. We have at last a means of tracing the origin of the nations and of carrying them back to a common trunk, which was altogether lacking to the ancients. This is the comparative analysis of languages. Let us set aside the illusion that linguistics is somehow a separate science and a science independent of the racial question. Linguistics follows a taxonomic system. It is in fact a taxonomy of peoples, which means there was a previous decision to classify and arrange peoples, which means that the taxonomic model for classifying biological entities had to come. There's a long paper Vishwa and I wrote about this that Siddhi will share the link with you for. So there is a continuous move between comparative anatomy, botany or biology, then to classifying humans, then to race, and then to linguistics. So Schlegel begins with a discussion of the traits. If you look on your handout, you will see on the second page, I won't read out the long quote. It is the longest quote in the middle of the second page. And I'll just give you the first starting point of that quote. The face of an oval shape, the forehead high, dominating the lower parts, the cheekbones effaced by the cheeks, etc. These are the physical traits that link the Indians, or the Aryan Indians specifically, although that distinction we have yet to come across, with the Persians, the Arabs, and of Europe. Okay. Skin color is not the criterion. In fact, he will go to craniometry, that he will say Blumenbach, his teacher, did the most important work. He established that it is the structure of the skull, the cranium, that tells you something about intelligence, that tells you about the group of people. And then he will say, Blumenbach has divided humankind into 5 races, but by his studies, Hindus still fall within the Caucasian race. However, it is not the examination of skulls that settles the issue. It is the affiliation of languages, that Hindus speak Sanskrit, which is the same advanced family of languages. This will confirm the cranial differences that Blumenbach established. I want you to notice something very specific about this article. The linguistic inquiry is raised after the race question arises. There is no such thing as an independent linguistic inquiry here. It was undertaken, it will be undertaken to confirm the racial classification. Okay, so much to get you on speed with Schlegel. But in fact, the linguistic classification is never undertaken. This is Schlegel again, admitting that the affiliation of languages justifies the conclusion, and according to my conviction, it will justify it insofar as it be examined in greater depth, etc., etc., etc. I won't read the rest. You will see that he ends up with the question of the original homeland of this common nation or the mother nation. But in this article, I've read the whole thing. At no point is the linguistic proof provided. So it starts with the race, shifts to language, says they're the same race, and then says, let's look for a common homeland. Let me get myself some water. This is a slide sidebar. I will skip this slide. If anyone thinks German Indology is independent of caste, that it only had race and not caste, they're fooling themselves. In fact, German Indology had a very strong notion of innate differences between different peoples. And this is one of the things they liked about what they thought was ancient India or Aryan India pre-confusion of racial distinctions. And they wanted to preserve this. I won't read this slide. Let's move on. Schlegel denies that the Shudras are different race, but he says, yes, there is a different race in India. These are the Bhils or the Gonds. And look at them, they are Negroes. He uses that word. So race and caste now begin to be mapped onto each other in a complex way. The whole Aryan homeland question repeats here. He keeps Schlegel's view. Remember, Schlegel had said there is one central human race that gave culture to everyone else. It migrated and gave culture to everyone else. So he maintains his brother's view of a single point of origin, and he says it is Bactriana. And he thus preserves the kinship of Europeans and Asiatics, saying from Bactriana, one went west, one went east, but they are still one common people. And the skulls will show this, as Blumenbach told us, but his research will be confirmed by language. So language will also show you that connection. This will be the subject of Indology in great part. This is a concluding summary. The interest in race precedes the interest in language. The language question is kept open. And at the end, Schlegel explicitly affirms that what he seeks is not language families, but racial families. Okay, I won't read the long quote. Let's pause there for a bit. We are now going to come to Lassen, who is a student of Schlegel's, took over his chair in Bonn, and becomes a very important figure in fusing these two aspects. So we have seen the anti-Judaic aspect through Luther. We have seen the racial aspect, the negation of Africa as a cultured people, or even as an intelligent people, and the linking of Asia and Europe. These are the two pillars that will now combine in Lassen, who combines the racist and the anti-Semitic components. Let me pause here and take any questions that you have.
So, Jaideep, I think actually you should continue, and people can type in the questions. We'll come back to the questions a little later.
All right, okay, let's continue then. So let me go back to full screen view. The biracial theory is the view that Indian civilization is composed of two components: the Aryan, which is the culture giving, and the primitive, the aboriginal, which receives culture but is also responsible for a lot of unattractive practices and different religious ideas. Scholars typically say that Schlegel comes up with the biracial theory, but in fact he explicitly rejects it. The other racial group are only the Gonds or the tribals. They are not the Shudras according to him. It is Lassen who first gives this theory its proper form. These are actual quotes from him. I will quickly run through them. The Indian constitution is based on the combination of peoples of different descent into political union. So India has been formed, the race has been formed by fusing together different groups of people. Culture, however, both groups are not equal. It's not like your mother and your father bringing equal amounts of intelligence or wealth or personality into the relationship. One is dominant. One will give the culture, the other will receive it. And then he articulates his thesis. The most important and influential fact of Indian ethnography is the real India is peopled by at least two great national races, the Aryan and the Deccanistic. So all of Indian history will now be explained in terms of this raciology. Bennis attributes the first use of Aryan as a racial term to Lassen. This is not exactly correct. There were some predecessors that we now know in scholarship, but Lassen certainly popularized it, and Gobineau and Chamberlain extensively cited Lassen. Vishwa and I have a paper on this that I could give you the citation for. There are several characteristic features of this. A subfamily, so the Aryans are a subfamily within the Indo-Germanic family. He assigns them to a race and to a language group. And finally, color is negated as a criterion, yet remains. This last point will be important. If you look around and ask yourself, why is this point important? You will see that the presence of a highly erudite, learned culture, civilization in the East, always posed a problem to Europe. And the skin color of Indians was always a stumbling block in all these theories that try to unite India and Europe. So you will see a specific way in which Lassen will now cope with this problem. The Aryan Indians, not all Indians, the Aryan Indians belong to the Caucasian race by their language and physical type. Their darker skin color does not reach such a degree of black that we cannot derive it from the effect of climactic influences. So although Indians are darker than the Caucasian, they are not the black, the Negroid race. Remember, Schlegel had excluded that race from civilization, from humanity. So the blackness here has to be explained as a different kind of blackness. It will be climactically influenced. Both Schlegel brothers are validated because Lassen's criteria are language and physiognomy. Remember, Schlegel had introduced language and August Schlegel had said skull type, skull size, and skull shape. So language and physiognomy are retained. Skin color is downplayed, but it will return in a new way. Lassen has to downplay skin color because the South Indians, his Deccanistic Indians, do not differ so much from his Aryans. Indeed, the only relevant distinction is the language. So he says, the Deccanistic Indians have the Caucasian physiognomy and form. Their skin color is darker than that of the Aryans, however, without attaining the black of the Negroes. However, their language is fundamentally different. So he will separate them in the end. He cannot separate them on physiognomy. He separates them on language. Color must be negated as a criterion if Indian Aryans and Indo-Germans are to be included in one group. So what is he doing? He's taking the Indian population, dividing it into Aryan and Deccanistic, breaking it apart, taking the Aryan group of them and taking them with the Europeans and saying, these are the Indo-Germans. And then he is leaving the other half of it. So he has to negate color as a relevant criterion if this split is to be possible. Thus, what is really only a linguistic distinction, language families, is being made to substitute for a racial distinction, families of people, by weakening the relevant physical criteria. Okay? I understand this is a little complicated. This is all based on quotes in Lassen's Indische Altertumskunde, and Vishwa and I read that text, went through it for these key passages, and you see how they're playing fast and loose, moving people in and out of boxes, saying these are the cultured peoples, these are the primitives. Where have we seen this before? The notion of the saved and the damned that is there with Luther and before that with Paul. So a theological distinction is working itself out into a racial distinction through history. Now, just as there was one group that was part of history, Lassen will confirm this and say, the Aryan race is the most important one to study. I came back recently from a conference on the Aryans in India, and it is interesting how even that conference fulfilled Lassen's promise. He has, in a way, tricked all of India into obsessing about this issue, talking about this issue, acting like there is something like the Aryan race, acting like it is the subject of history, like history has no other concern than to determine this race and where it came from and where it settled and whether it went east or whether it went west. We have all fallen into the trap of Aryanism. We have also all fallen into the trap of thinking of history in these national racial terms. This has been the most damaging legacy of Indology on Indian studies. Okay, I will skip application of the Mahabharata and this thing because it is all in the book. Let's sum up now. Let's get towards the end of this presentation. I said at the beginning that Indology does not mean just Indian studies. It does not just mean the different fields of endeavor that Indians have engaged in throughout their history, or the different sciences, the different shastras, the different fields they have been active in. Indology is a specific approach to Indian thought, to Indian traditions, and we can call it race science of an Aryan history. Now, you see there is an asterisk on history. History does not mean here just chronology. So everyone thinks history is the most basic way to approach any subject. Correct in a way. Knowing dates, knowing when something happened, this is bare chronological material, right? So we are all familiar with this, we all engage in it. But the specific sense in which Indology insists on history is not the sense of a bare chronology. It is that history refers to the intellectual products of the human mind. And as we saw from the previous quote from Lassen, what has to be studied is the entire Aryan world in its totality, because that is the true bearer of history. How is this so? Lassen himself tells us. What is to be determined here are the properties independent of historical development and hence belong to the people as such and precisely determine the peculiarity of their historical development. So it's not the properties independent of, it is the properties independent of what happened to them in history, but something intrinsic that has to be studied. The real subject of history is that intrinsic quality in a people that determines the way they develop in history. You see the essentialization? History is now taking on a very specific meaning of a racial study of a people. In other words, what is to be studied is the racial distinctiveness of the Aryans. Our investigation in Indology is a race science through and through. The conjecture we articulated earlier, history is race science, and race science is history in the work of the Indologist, is thus borne out. When an Indologist says we must study things historically, he means racially. Lassen himself confirms this. It would be a great error to believe that physical influences alone or primarily determine the basic character of a people. India shows this clearly enough. The Deccanistic and the Vindhya people stood under the same natural influences as the Aryans, but never on their own elevated themselves to a higher development. So climate, geography, physical conditions do not explain the development of a people. To understand a people, you have to look at something intrinsic within them that destines them for culture, that destines them for greatness. And if they are one of the people destined for that culture, then they are the proper subject of history. We must therefore recognize a foundation of the character and original spiritual disposition among the peoples, which when developed or more closely determined by the external nature of the country as well as by historical events, is facilitated or hindered. So there is something intrinsic in a people given the right conditions. It's like a plant. If there's sunshine, there's fertilizer, there's water, there is something intrinsic in it that predestines it for a certain trajectory. Other plants, even in those conditions, will not have that trajectory. Now, I started this presentation with a little theological background. It may have been a lot for some of you, I'm aware of that, but there was a reason for it. Because through and through, German Indology is saturated, permeated with the spirit of Christian theology, specifically in its Protestant form. And you will see this in the next slide. It is the genius of the peoples breathed into them by the creation, that is the creator, that under the effects of nature and in keeping with the course of history exhibits itself in its unique form. This is a quote from Lassen, but I have put three people on this slide. On the right, you see Christian Lassen speaking. But remember, before Lassen, someone had already made this distinction between one group of people that was destined, that was the civilizing race, that was the true subject of history, that history was the unfolding of this race as it developed and grew and gave culture to others, and excluded another group of people from this history. That is the very ugly, obese gentleman looking on your left, Friedrich Schlegel. If behind Lassen's with this distinction stands Friedrich Schlegel with a distinction, behind him also stands someone else. There is the ghost of Luther hovering in the background. The petty salvation drama that Indologists and Schlegel had been working out with Luther in the background, directing his beloved Germans, has played itself out. Only one thing remains: a Holocaust. Here also with Luther in the background, Lassen is the key. These are quotes directly from Lassen. I began by showing you all the things that Luther had said about the Jews. Now the contrast between the Jews, the Semites, and the Aryans is achieved for the first time in Christian Lassen. And these are quotes from him. We must regard the Aryan people's share in the possession of this higher endowment as the highest and most important gift of nature, as a special favoring through fate or providence. So it is fate itself that has given one people a gift a special endowment. It has destined them for something special. Look at the theological language in the background. Only a few peoples of the earth participate in this enablement. Now comes the kicker. Among the Caucasians, only the Semites and the Indo-Germans have this enablement to a higher culture. However, the latter are without a doubt the most talented, and these two groups are not equal regarding these achievements. Among the Caucasian peoples, we decisively grant the laurels to the Indo-Germans. And look at the last point. We do not consider this accidental, but believe it springs from the higher and more complete gifts of the latter. So there is an intrinsic belief in the superiority of one group. Belief, as you know, is a theological concept. It's a theological term. You also know that Luther rested the whole notion of salvation through Christ on faith or on belief. So somehow that the entire theological content of that distinction has been secularized and brought into history. History becomes the place where a certain salvation drama unfolds. Where do we find proof of the special chosen status of the Germans? Luther already anticipated it. Lassen now confirms it. This is on your handout. I will not read it out. It is the last quote on the handout on the bottom of the second page, going into the third page. Notice the first word. I have underlined it. History is evidence that the Semites lacked the harmonious balance of all psychic powers through which the Indo-Germans became preeminent. Underlined history. History itself, if you study history, history itself will tell you who is chosen, who is not, whom God has favored, whom he has broken with. Therefore, you must study history. Remember, I said in the very beginning that there's a certain importance now to the study of history that cannot be explained otherwise than from a theological anxiety. Okay, I won't read the last quote. Let's bring this back. What does this have to do with India? By emphasizing history, Indologists derive legitimacy from it. If history tells you one group is chosen and the history they do tells you that they belong to the chosen group, then they are automatically legitimated in a way Indians are delegitimated. Further, because the historical narrative culminates in the European present, it automatically puts the European in the position of rendering judgment on other cultures. Europe will assign other cultures their place within this taxonomy of more civilized, less civilized, primitive, excluded from the divine plan. Europe as the apex will tell you where you fit into that. And all cultures will look to Europe, or to the Indologists in particular here, for validation. We saw this in the work of the two Schlegels, Lassen, Garber, Oldenburg, etc. I didn't show you the Garber and Oldenburg slides. I'll do a separate PowerPoint someday on that. This is what, so that was a complex idea I tried to share with you, that everyone now looks to Europe, to the Indologists for validation, right? It's a complex idea. A picture is worth 1,000 words. This is a Indologist from Tübingen being given 20,000 euros and an award by the President of India. And why? As if there are not enough hungry, poor Sanskritists in India or excellent scholars in India. But we are now looking for confirmation of identity, validation of a Hindu race, validation of its place within the civilizational plan, within the divine plan. And that is what this picture expresses. How did he get to this status? How did he come to stand there as an authoritative figure? Not overnight, not accidentally. In fact, he had a role in crafting the story by which he put himself at the apex. And that's what this looks like. Do you see the importance of history now? History is not some neutral thing. history is not some objective thing. The specific way we study things, the specific way we connect up individual events into larger wholes, the classifications we undertake. We do not tell histories of individuals. We do not tell histories of villages. We no longer even tell histories in terms of sacral kingship or dynasties. We tell history now in terms of nations. We tell histories in terms of how those different nations relate to each other and how in their struggles, essential characteristics are revealed about different peoples, and how the primitive peoples are destined to go under while the ones who are chosen through providence or chosen by providence arise. And then they look back and confirm this history. Okay?
Yeah, Jaydeep, just let me make a comment here. What this says is that this picture, what it communicates is that the Hindus are accorded a place in the Indo-Aryan family, a place of eminence, because of all the literary products and the Sanskrit language and everything that they had produced in the past. But the Hindu race has now been superseded, and now we have to look to the look beyond Hinduism in order to find progress or salvation or whatever it is that we might be looking for.
It's an excellent point, and in fact, the explicit statements that are made that say that the Hindus came up to this certain point, but we Germans now have to take over and we have to complete the process for them.
Right.
So I just adore this picture. Let me see if I can go back and do it once more because it's just fun. So that's where we are today. This is not accidental. It is the product of a narrative that has been told, and that narrative culminates in the European present with the Indologist rendering judgment in his backward gaze on history. He is rendering judgment on all of history. It's a position of immense power and, of course, benefits, privileges that accrue to him.
So, Jaydeep, I want to I want to mark that we've exceeded our time. Okay. So, I obviously want to make a couple of remarks here. That first of all, this webinar is being offered as part of Hindu University of America's ongoing series of webinars, and our intention is to invite you all into the curriculum being offered at HUA. And particularly if you want to get started with Hindu University of America, the place to begin is to take the Orientation to Hindu Studies course. Having said that, I'll also make a note that Jaydeep is offering a full course, a 3 credit hour course next quarter, beginning in the month of April. And the name of the course is Aryanism and Indology. Right, Jaydeep?
Yes.
And that course will meet for 3 hours a week for about 11 weeks. And it will involve extensive reading and engagement, reflection, and even some writing. So writing some essays and so on. So those of you who might be interested, I'd like to invite you to participate. And with that, I'd like to close the formal webinar at this moment. Okay, and I'll ask Siddhi to stop the recording. But those of you who want to stay and have some more discussions, you're welcome. And Jaydeep, if you're okay, you can stay for a few more minutes. Okay.
I am happy to stay as long as you want.
Yeah.
If anyone is planning to leave before you sort of click off, please do stay and engage, because a very, very vital part of this research and activity that Vishwa and I do is to restore the broken pieces of community, to understand what happened, and for people to express and discuss themselves. And therefore, your input is valuable. It's part of the course for us.
Right. So there's a question, can the PowerPoint be downloaded? No, I don't think the PowerPoint is available for sharing, okay? But you can get a recording of this webinar if you request it. And there'll be a follow-up email that'll ask you to engage with it. So there's another question. Can you convey